Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Let's give it a few more minutes as the attendees are all joining. We'll start in a few minutes.
April got any jokes to share?
No. No jokes.
Next time.
Okay. All right. So let's kick it off. I don't want to let everyone wait too long. I am April Kushner. I am a partner here at SAX'S in our nonprofit practice, and I am joined here today with Adam Holzberg, who's also a partner in our nonprofit practice, and Lauren Frary, who is our Director of Strategic Business Transformation. So while Adam and I focus primarily on audit and tax for nonprofits, Lauren is our expert when it comes to all things operational and fundraising for nonprofits. So we thought today's topic was really important for the nonprofit industry. We want to talk a little bit about the Giving USA report and a few other studies that have been done, just to give you that overview. So the reports are quite lengthy. If you haven't had time to read them, we're going to summarize them all for you. So thank you again for joining us today. We are SAX'S. We are a top 75 accounting, audit, and consulting firm. I'm really happy to bring you this broadcast today. So a few disclaimers is that we are not offering any CPE for today's session. Please feel free to enter any questions into the box, and we will pull those up at the end of the presentation. And this recording, this presentation is going to be recorded, and so it'll be available in 24 hours. It'll be posted up on our SAX'S website along with all of our other nonprofit resources. So feel free to circle back, look at the recording, and share it with others who may have missed it live. Okay, so here are our sources for today's webinar. So Giving USA's annual report, they put out one each year. Like I said, it's quite lengthy, so we're going to summarize some of the key points for you. It compares the 2023 overall giving landscape to the prior year. So we're going to be looking at some of those stats just to give you an overview of what's going on with philanthropy and giving. We also use some sources from the National Council of Nonprofits. There's also some sources for the Chronicles of Philanthropy. So they put out recent articles all the time about what's going on. So we've used those to summarize for you. And the Generosity Commission. They also put out a report, so we're going to touch on some of that. So a quick look for you of nonprofits by the numbers. So Adam, Lauren, and I, we work with nonprofits all the time. We really enjoy it, but we know that nonprofits, there are so many of the nonprofit organizations out there across the entire nation. So there are actually 1.3 million nonprofit organizations nationally. You as nonprofits employ 12.3 million employees, which is 10% of the entire workforce in the US. There is over $2 trillion spent annually by nonprofit organizations. In 2022 and 2023, there was approximately 60 million Americans who volunteered with nonprofit organizations. And nonprofits are funded from a variety of sources, which we know, right? So individual donations, government grants, contracts and foundations, corporate philanthropy through fee-for-service and other sources. So sometimes I joke that my nonprofits are like 3 companies rolled into one because of all this different funding that you get. Makes it challenging, but you know, we really love to see, you know, all the good that the nonprofits are doing. It's really impressive to see that there's 1.3 million nonprofit organizations with a mission to help their communities. So that's wonderful. Okay, so we're going to summarize those studies and reports for you. There are several subsectors of the nonprofit community that were included in the Giving USA report. And although growth income subsectors were noted, it was not enough growth to really outpace inflation. So while giving is still strong, there's a lot of giving, it was not enough to really outpace the inflation and the rising costs that organizations are seeing year over year. So the top 3 most impacted subsectors with a decline of 8% or more included foundations, public society benefits, social services, international affairs, and the only subsector that did outpace inflation in terms of giving was education and the arts and culture. So it'd be nice if we had more of those, but those were the 2 that did outpace inflation. And I know a lot of organizations are in that human service and health category, subcategory. So that category did stay flat year over year. So these are kind of, some top-sided summaries of the Giving USA report. Most of the subcategories did see giving that was down in relation to inflation, but I think still some good news there. There were some subsectors that had increased, and human services and health stayed flat year over year. Okay. All right.
So I'm going to dive into some of the numbers. Again, this is from the Giving USA report and really comparing contributions overall between 2023 and 2018. And as you can see, there was an increase, a total increase of contributions by $129 billion. Individual giving, although down slightly, is still obviously the largest part of giving in the United States. Foundations is up slightly, as is corporate giving. So, these are really important numbers because understanding where the money is coming from will help you strategize when you start to plan out your annual giving plan.
Also want to point out, while the figures are founded, they're also rounded. I couldn't resist pointing that out.
The figures are rounded too. Next slide. So this slide really talks about the subsector of the nonprofit world and kind of who's giving where. Again, you can see that religion continues to be strong, continues to be the largest subsector that receives the giving. Foundations are up slightly, as is human services. Again, the figures are rounded. But you can see that overall, the giving to subsectors is remaining somewhat steady, which is good. But there is diversity in giving in terms of all of the different subsectors.
Mm-hmm.
So
oh,
go ahead.
So now looking at some changes in giving by the source. So now we're looking at inflation adjusted numbers. So looking over the last couple of years, really what direction has giving gone, adjusted for inflation. So you can see in total, giving has gone down 10% over the past couple of years, 10.3%. That's largely driven by the decline in individuals. So before Lauren pointed out, individuals makes up the largest share of giving. So with that decline from individuals, that's really driving the decline in overall giving. Also, just want to point out with individuals, it's not just the total number that's going down, it's also the number of households who are giving. I think right now it's about 50% of American households give. And I think 10 years ago, that number was probably around 2/3 of Americans. So the number of people who are giving is declining. And with that as well, the people who are giving is consolidating to a smaller number. So now I believe it's 75% of individual giving is now consolidated to 3% donors. So it's gone, overall giving from individuals is becoming, it's really coming from a smaller group of individuals. So there's something to keep in mind as we move forward with the giving landscape. Foundations up a little bit, relatively flat. With foundations, that's really impacted by stock market performance. So typically how the stock market did in a prior year kind of impacts how and where things move in the current year. So in 2022, the stock market went down. So you can see in 23, foundation giving is down. So in 23, stock market is up, or was up. So hopefully when we look at the data for 24, we'll see an improvement from foundational giving. Bequests down overall the past couple of years, down 8%. But still, this is the area to keep in mind because there's going to be a lot of generational wealth transfer over the next several years. So while it's down, adjusted for inflation right now, this is still a big area that should be focused on. And then corporations up slightly, relatively flat, and that's largely just driven by, profit before taxes, GDP growth. A lot of economic data really kind of is the guidelines on when to expect corporation to increase or decrease. So when people are feeling good about the economy, when corporations are being profitable, that's when you'll see that number kind of increase, and then vice versa, the other direction. So next slide. All right, so now looking at the changes with all the different type of recipients. So while religion is the largest recipient of donations, it has gone down about 4%. Education is up 12%. Human services relatively flat. Foundations have one of the largest swings, and foundations overall typically more volatile, just because they're more dependent on larger size gifts. The other large declines really in international affairs. That's actually the largest decline, 29%. A lot of times there's just impact because people are more focused on their own community, what's going on by their home, and not necessarily what's going on around the world. So it's a little harder when it comes to international affairs nonprofits. We can kind of see, so health stayed flat, arts, culture, humanities up, environment, animals up. So depending on the sector, some sectors came out stronger than others when looking at this. Next slide. So this is total giving, looking all the way back to 1983 to 2023. The columns is the inflation adjusted dollars. The line part is the current dollars. So you can see overall giving has steadily increased. When looking at it from looking at current dollar standpoint, it's really on declined a couple times. Once during the great financial crisis, the Great Recession in between 08 and 2010, and then once again during 22 declines. One other thing to point out, because it comes up a lot, is how do presidential elections really impact giving? Because we are in a, if you're not aware, we are in a presidential election year. So when you look at this, starting with, start with 84, 88, and keep going every 4 years, every year giving has increased. So even during presidential elections, even though there's millions and billions being raised by the candidates, is not really pushing out the nonprofits. They're still raising funds. They're still, increasing the total share of donations. Whether or not it keeps up with inflation is a different story, but the current dollar amount is increasing. The only time a presidential election saw a decline was during the financial crisis, Otherwise, giving always increases.
This
So
is
next,
probably Adam's favorite slide.
I like history, so kind of plays into part all of that. So a glance at individual giving, just as a shared disposable income, it roughly always stays at 2%. Now this is, just sharing that household incomes really impact giving. When talking to individuals, the number one reason why they say they can't give is because they can't afford it. Their own household necessities come first before they ever really volunteer and contribute to a nonprofit. So this is, it stays relatively around 2%. It has gone down the last couple of years. Just something to keep in mind. And so now this is looking at the same kind of information, type of recipients, but now solely looking at DAFs, donor advised funds. So just a little background on donor advised funds. These are investment vehicles that are set up where individuals can donate or put money into. They get a charitable donation for tax purposes. The money raised in the fund increases tax-free, and all the money in there needs to be used for charitable purposes. Now with DAFs, there are no rules when it comes to minimum distributions. Like a private foundation has minimum distribution rules, and there's no time limit. So technically, someone could put money in a DAF and keep it in there for 20 years and never move any money out, which is some of the concerns with DAFs. But when looking at this chart is solely looking at DAF from the standpoint of, all right, for people with DAFs, where are they giving the money? And looking at this, the top three remains the same, just the order. So with DAFs, looking at charitable giving as a whole, the top three is religion, human services, and education. When it comes to DAFs, the order slightly changes. Education is first, then human services, and then religion. So still relatively the same, but slightly different. And then it's actually interesting if you dig in deeper, based on where the funds are being held. So whether it's a community foundation or if it's with a brokerage company like Vanguard or Schwab, the recipients, the sources, all changes. So you can go even more granular if you want and really dig in and see, all right, people who hold a Schwab account really give to this kind of sector and really dig deep into that. But this is just looking at DAFs as a whole. And then just talking about, proposed reforms. So as of right now, there is no major reforms to DAFs. There has been some proposed legislation. Nothing's ever really, moved past being proposed. But this is a growing concern because DAF accounts are increasing dramatically. It's becoming more and more prevalent and it's becoming more and more accessible. A lot of brokerage companies, investment brokerage companies, are doing away with minimum requirements. So it makes it a lot more accessible to the everyday person and not where in the past it was really more for high net worth individuals. As I mentioned, there are currently no minimum payout requirements. So some of the proposed legislation is trying to tackle that. Putting in minimum payout requirements like a private foundation, putting in time limits on when the money needs to be paid out. The typical legislation says about 5 years. So it's something to keep in mind of. I'm assuming eventually something is going to change. I just don't know when, but it's on, it's on Congress's minds, and especially with tax reform. So does the Tax Act that was passed in 2018 or 2017 is expiring soon. So they're going to have to do some sort of tax reform and potentially DAFs be part of that reform bill. So something to just keep in mind. So I think Lauren, you're up.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so we also, one of the other reports that we looked at was the Generosity Commission report. And again, a very large report that we just wanted to summarize specifically for the nonprofit sector. And what this report looked at was the trend of volunteers and donors and why they're reducing their participation in giving to the nonprofit sector. And the report had 3 major findings and recommendations for the nonprofit sector. The first one was kind of better communication between the domains of academic research and nonprofit practice. What does this mean? It really means that academia is doing a lot of studies, they have a lot of data, but they're not necessarily involving the nonprofit sector. We need the nonprofit sector to actually be at the table during these studies so that they can actually start to drive the agenda based on the true experience of the nonprofit. So one of the recommendations is to really get the nonprofits and the academia together at the table to drive research and data that will support nonprofit efforts. The second recommendation was the need for greater investment. Now, April and Adam, you know, we sound like broken records, but we always talk about the need to invest in your infrastructure, right? What does that mean? Investing in people and technology, right? And one of the investments that we really need to see is fundraising capacity. And often there's this kind of shyness around really reporting on the true expense related to fundraising efforts. And so that really needs to shift, and nonprofits really need to make it a priority to really be clear about the cost of fundraising, right? People need to understand that. And philanthropy needs to start to shift and understand the need for nonprofits to invest in infrastructure, including their fundraising efforts, and actually provide capacity building grants. We are seeing a lot more capacity building grants out there, so that's a great trend. And I think nonprofits really need to kind of seek out those grants to see if they can help, again, invest in their infrastructure. The third recommendation was to support fundraising across a broad range of diverse communities, right? Including our smaller organizations, organizations that serve communities of color, and organizations that are led by people of color. And again, I am starting to see an uptick in specific funding, specific grants for our BIPOC organizations. We're also seeing initiatives around BIPOC leadership and coalitions to help support those leaders, those diverse leaders, in becoming a strong force in their communities. The BIPOC community, the BIPOC organizations tend to be underrepresented and underfunded. So this is a great initiative to make sure that all organizations, all diverse organizations, have opportunities for some of these grants and these funding opportunities. So we threw at you a lot of information, a lot of data. What does this all mean? Well, one, giving is strong. It's still strong. So there are absolutely opportunities. I think that philanthropy from individuals is still the largest subsector of giving, right? So you always want to think about that in your fundraising strategy. How do you cultivate and steward the individual givers? And I would say if you have to spend money on either recruitment or retention of your current individual donors, I would say that dollar is better spent on retention. Cultivation and relationship building continues to be a key activity. You can't just receive funds and not cultivate those relationships. Cultivation is super important to maintain long-term, multi-year gifts. Stewardship is more important than ever, right? Making sure that there's transparency, people understand the impact of their giving and where their giving dollars are going. And of course, a solid, robust annual or impact report is a key communication tool that also provides transparency to your donors and the public about who you are, what you're doing, your impact in the community, and how you're using your donor dollars.
Mhm.
So this is my favorite slide. Coming
You'll have
from
favorite slides.
all these slides about, who's giving to what, right? So we have, many generations out there giving, and they certainly have their preferences. We are starting to see our younger generations engaged in philanthropy. They certainly have their specific giving preferences, mostly around children's nonprofits, environment, and animals. Our older generations are really more focused on religion, veteran services, and emergency relief efforts. So this information is good, again, in terms of your strategy. When you are creating a giving campaign, you can literally have one campaign and kind of modify it so that it speaks to each one of these generations to see if you can kind of get giving kind of across the generations. And then again, some of the important causes by generation. So our older generations absolutely tend to give towards religion, veterans affairs, and healthcare, while our younger generations are really focused on climate change, education, and I would throw in there animal causes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so here you'll see we have 5 boxes here. These are our trends to watch. So one of them would be diversifying your fundraising strategy. Really important trend. You want to make sure that you are being intentional, that you are being strategic with your fundraising efforts. Another trend is using AI correctly for fundraising. So we hear about AI a lot, but we wanted to, you mentioned this as a trend in terms of using it correctly for fundraising. So there are a lot of times where people have said, well, I can tell that was written by AI because the way the language is written, it just doesn't seem like a human had written this article or this piece of content and things like that. So you want to make sure that you're using AI correctly for your fundraising. It's great to give you a starting point for some ideas, and then from there, really tweaking it and customizing it based on what you need. I think it's a really good starting point, but something that still needs some editing, I think. Appealing to individual donors, as Lauren said, individual giving is still the largest source of giving for nonprofits. So you'll want to customize and strategize for your individual donors. As Lauren said, generational giving can vary, the causes that they give to can vary. So just keeping that in mind. Digital fundraising. Digital fundraising is also really important for nonprofits in terms of making sure that you've got all the information on your website, everything's accessible for an individual who's going to go on your website. Some like to give online, some like to give by checks. Just something to keep in mind going forward with your digital fundraising efforts. And then trust-based philanthropy. Adam, I'll give this one to you. A little bit about trust-based philanthropy, another favorite topic of his.
So trust-based philanthropy is essentially the mindset, I'll put it very bluntly, to trust a nonprofit, that you give them the money and you trust them to use it appropriately and correctly, where you don't need to put in all these strings attached, all these restrictions. The nonprofit knows best on how to use the funds effectively and to trust them in that process. So this is where we go into unrestricted support. It's a big area. not just because it's important for nonprofits to be able to use the funds as they need to, whether that's to help improve the programs or to build infrastructure. Whatever it is, the nonprofit should know best. And that's kind of the trust-based philanthropy mindset there, is that founders or funders should really give and then step back nicely.
Nicely. Okay. So we're going to give you some strategies in the next few slides, recommendation strategies that you can actually implement. So one of them is around social media content. So we did talk about digital fundraising a little. This kind of falls under your social media and digital reach. Be intentional and keep it simple. A lot of content that's being put out there isn't actually read. So you'll see the third bullet point here. We have a stat that 92% of all content that is being put out there in the world isn't actually getting read, because it's really just a little bit of an overload of digital content, I think, between all the social media platforms, emails. I can tell you my email box is kind of sad and overwhelmed on a regular basis. So if you are putting content out there, you need to be intentional and keep it simple. Although sometimes the shorter the better. Pictures go a long way, stats and facts go a long way. If you're going to put out a really long article, you need to know your audience and whether or not they're going to read that article, or if they're going to read a few paragraphs down and stop. So sometimes that short, simple content does best. Short videos, short pictures are often more appealing to donors.
So now just, a fundraising strategy or plan. So basically you should plan on having different initiatives. So events, major gifts, online fundraising, strategic partnerships, and so on. And what you're trying to do is just collecting data on all these different initiatives and seeing what is working best, where are the trends, and using that data to really adjust accordingly. You also can use this to kind of help develop more accountability with your development staff. Now that you're creating these plans and you're creating these benchmarks and data, you can now really get better monitoring standards when it comes to your staff. And next slide. All right, so then strategies around data and transparency. So you should know the stats of your organization and its impact. So you should know what the KPIs, key performance indicators are, and be able to track them. Donors care about the impact as part of the story that you can tell, and you really need to know, be able to track that and deliver those numbers. The best way to really promote that to the world is through annual reports. And from there, you can really highlight your impact, and this just creates further transparency of what you've been doing throughout the year, what kind of impact you've been having within the community. You kind of see the theme throughout this whole presentation is that there's a lot of data out there, whether it's externally or it should be internally as well. And it's really just trying to get a sense of how to comprehend all that data and best use it for your organization.
What kind of KPIs would you recommend?
So it depends. Now I'm going to move aside financial KPIs. That's really separate. You really should develop KPIs that match and fit your organization, what you are doing. So I'm going to do a very basic example. If you're a food kitchen, the KPIs are going to be the meals served. It's a very basic one. It really should be matched based on your mission, what you're trying to do, what your programs are, and then deliver that message. And then what message does your donors want, and then find the data that best meshes that all together.
I would add to that too. When you talk about statistics for your organization, right? So you absolutely want to know, right, how you impact your community, but you also want to talk about, you have your primary beneficiaries, right, if you're providing a service. You also want to talk about the impact on secondary and tertiary beneficiaries, right? So if your program serves children, you also want to talk about how the entire family is impacted and how the entire community benefits. benefits. And that's another way to think about your KPIs.
Mhm. Yeah, good point.
So strategies regarding cultivation and stewardship. These are two key areas that oftentimes nonprofits forget to actually put in their plan, to actually have a cultivation and stewardship plan. And some of the things that you can include in your cultivation and stewardship plan include things like making sure there are 6 to 7 touch points for donors and potential donors. And of course, each touch point is not an ask. It might be just information, it might be a thank you or acknowledgement, but make sure that you are keeping your donors and your potential donors informed and up to date about what you're doing, your activities, your programs. Certainly recognition and appreciation events. I love a good volunteer donor appreciation event. It doesn't have to be extravagant, but it is a really great way to get people in the room and networking with each other and talking about how great your organization is and how they want to support and increase that impact. Certainly highlighting all of your donors in your marketing materials. Maybe you highlight a donor or a grant in your newsletter. Certainly when you do your annual reports, you want to recognize your donors and your givers. There's also, if you have a large number of donors that give very generously, you might want to consider creating what I would call a legacy society, right? A society for recognizing those donors that give very generously and very consistently. So consider having a legacy society for your donors. Certainly invite, when possible, invite donors and grantors to your site, your programs, to meet the people that you serve, to see where you are having that impact in your community. People really do want to see what you're doing. They really do want to see where their dollar went. And there's no better way to do that than to invite them to your programs.
Mhm.
Certainly one-on-one invitations, coffee, tea, lunch, whatever is feasible. But remember, fundraising at its core is relationship building. And so you really do want to make the effort to personally know your donors so that you are better equipped to actually acknowledge them. And continuing that personal relationship, right? And making sure that you are building it while you're also cultivating new donors. So those are some tips for cultivation and stewardship. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about just donations, right? So I think almost all nonprofits now have a donation page on their website, and that's great. One thing that I have noticed that becomes a problem is that you don't have all of your donor information, all the information a donor would need on one page. So make sure that your donor page has, you know, the address, the phone number, the mailing address. Donors, sometimes we still have donors who want to write a check, and if they don't have the address to send the check, then there's the potential you'll lose them. Make sure that your EIN number is on that donor page so that they can report that as needed. So again, just make sure that all the information a donor would need is all in one place. Sometimes donors will look, and if they don't have what they need in one place, they're going to move on to the next organization. So don't run that risk. I think the other thing you want to be clear about is you want to have a gift acceptance policy that talks about what gifts you will accept and also what you won't accept, right? I had a gift acceptance policy that I wrote for an organization, and one of the things that they would not accept were things like airplanes, because the cost to manage that donation outweighed the benefit of the donation. So think intentionally about what you will or will not accept. And then if you accept stock, make sure that you have a policy on how you will treat that stock. Certainly, most organizations will sell it and put it into their account, but make sure that your policy addresses all of those different types of gifts and how you will treat them. It's also very important to have a donor acknowledgement policy, and that policy really talks about how and when you will acknowledge donors. Again, it's important to have that kind of standardized, and making sure that donors receive those letters or those acknowledgements in a timely manner. Certainly, most importantly, during the end of the year giving. Those many donors wait till the last minute based on their finances, and then they need that donor acknowledgement letter within 24 hours. So make sure you have a policy that will address that. There's probably one other policy that I would suggest, and that is an investment policy statement. And even though the nonprofit may not have investments, you never know when someone's going to walk through that door and give you one large donation. And so you want to be prepared for that. And if you have the opportunity to receive a large donation that you can invest, you want to be already set up with your investment policy statement. So those are some best practices that you can use for donations.
The airplane was very specific.
The airplane was very specific, yes. It did actually come.
And real live example.
A real example.
So in conclusion, the economic trends continue to impact the philanthropic marketplace. Fundraising is a complex and ever-evolving activity. Fundraising strategies need to be well-defined and supported by data. And again, I think the key word is strategies. Despite an overall decline in giving, philanthropy continues to be strong. As we mentioned, individuals are still the largest source of donations. Donors continue to show generosity, and keeping your donors informed, close and well stewarded will increase your success in future funding. So we're going to open it up now to Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in the box on the side, and we'll ask all of our presenters. But so I'm going to start off with Lauren. Lauren, is there a difference between a fundraising plan and an annual giving plan?
Well, yes. So a fundraising plan is your comprehensive plan that includes all of your activities, and then your donor plan would be a piece of that, right? So your fundraising plan, you really want to set every year, define your activities, define each goal and objective, right? So for instance, if you have events, right, each event, each gala, golf outing would have goals and objectives around the number of attendees, the revenue you want to generate, the expenses, right? And so your plan would go through each activity that you do and have goals and objectives so that you can measure that. But then there's all those different pieces, especially your donor plan. Your donor plan would actually be a piece of that.
What would be part of the annual giving plan?
So the annual giving plan is usually what you would use for your annual appeal, and right, and the strategy around that. Who are you going to give that to? Obviously, if you're a larger organization, you're doing a lot of fundraising, you want to be careful about what we call donor fatigue, right? That every donor doesn't get every invitation and every appeal. And so with your annual giving, you want to be strategic about who are the people that usually give towards annual giving, right, to your annual appeal, and create your strategy around that. I also would say that that plan should include a story. It should be a story about the organization or a story about the people that you serve, so that people are really clear about mission, vision, and impact of the organization through the people that you serve.
Yeah, good point. Are there any best practices around annual reports? If an organization's a fiscal year versus a calendar year end, what should the annual report be based on? Fiscal year or calendar year, would you recommend?
I've seen both. I don't know that it necessarily matters. I know a lot of annual reports do go out in the January timeframe. I think what's more important is what and how you're reporting your impact, right? There is definitely a trend towards more visually appealing reports as opposed to a lot of verbiage. Like you mentioned, April, right? A lot of that verbiage isn't read. So the recommendation is having visually stunning reports, big, bold colors, pictures of your impact, statistics around your impact, and then some information about your finances and your board. So it doesn't have to be a book, but it certainly does have to tell everybody what you're doing and how you're using your funding.
If it's a book, I'll still read it though.
Well, you allow them. Of course.
Yeah, and I think in terms of a numbers perspective, you could tie it into your fiscal year end if you were a June 30 year end. You know, I know sometimes year end giving is high around the holiday season, but at the same time, you know, if you're showing annual numbers, you know, you'll have that giving season within your reports if you're showing it as of 6/30 or whether you're showing it as of 12/31.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, donors, individuals, you know, people are bombarded during the holiday season. So there is an advantage to kind of, if you have a July 1 fiscal year or June 30 fiscal year, there is an advantage, right? Because your annual report might stand out a little bit more during a time that's not so busy with other mailings. So something to consider.
Yeah, good point. So Adam, when it comes to DAFs, how popular are they now?
They're becoming more and more and more popular. I think individual giving is not majority of individual giving. I think it's about 20%, roughly 25% of all individual giving is now DAF related, we'll call it. And it's growing dramatically, very quickly. So it's definitely an area to be mindful of. And the biggest issue with it as well, besides other factors, is that when people give, it's anonymous. It's coming through the DAF. You don't really see the name of who's giving unless they choose to tell you. So definitely a growing area of giving, and it's harder for nonprofits to see who's really providing the funds and then following up with them and doing the strategies that Lauren's saying.
Right, it makes that donor acknowledgement a lot harder.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a tip around DAFs is if someone has told you that they have, a donor has told you they have a DAF and that you'll receive it, one of the things you can ask the donor is if they would be willing to set a recurring annual donation to your organization so that they don't have to continue to go back to their fund and every year set the donation. They can actually create a recurring annual donation. So if you're aware of a DAF, that's certainly a conversation you can have with that donor.
The recurring donations are like nonprofit gold. So definitely one.
Exactly.
And we touched a little bit on, you know, being ready if you were to receive that large investment one day. You know, you generate enough of a surplus to be able to put it into an investment portfolio and get the best returns. What should really be included as part of that investment plan?
So usually an investment policy statement starts with kind of a risk tolerance assessment with the leadership of your organization so that you understand kind of how much risk you do or do not want to take with your investment. Certainly, you know, you also want to make sure that there's a certain portion of your investment in cash in the event that you have a rainy day need and you can access it. And then the rest of it is really about the strategy around how often you will review the investments, who's on the investment committee, and who will be looking at, or what will be the responsibilities of the investment manager, especially when it comes to kind of rebalancing. So the policy would talk about, you know, your risk tolerance, the strategy, and then monitoring.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Any last closing remarks?
Actually, I was going to ask April, do you want to go over this slide?
Sure, absolutely. We love nonprofits, Adam, Lauren, and myself. I'll say that. So thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We have all of our nonprofit resources up on our SAX'S website. Some of our newest is our Nonprofit Fundamentals video series. So this was designed to be short 10-minute videos about a variety of nonprofit topics, from accounting and functional expenses to things operational, like types of boards. And we really hope that's informational for everybody. And next week, actually, on Friday, October 25th, we are doing an in-person nonprofit conference. We really wanted to bring that networking for the group. We'll have a portion of networking, 2 sessions, lunch, and another session for you in the afternoon. And we wanted to make this conference all about fundraising. So we're going to continue that topic and hear from a few foundations. We're going to talk about individual giving, and then we're also going to talk about marketing and branding your organization or your programs. So we hope it'll be really informative. And then if you do attend, there'll be some networking and bowling at the end of the day, and I may even bring my own personal bowling ball with me. So if you do come,
We're all excited for that part.
if you do come, we hope to see you there. We hope it'll be really informative and some great networking for everybody to really get together.
And on the screen, there's QR codes. So you have your phone handy. You can do scan the QR code, and it'll bring you right to the page for the video series or for the event. So nice and accessible, just like your donation page on your website.
So feel free to contact us anytime you have any questions. We're always happy to help. Okay. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.